It's Monday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster.
The curtain closes on 4 long years of American decline, and we begin a brand new day of American strength and prosperity.
In just under 5 hours, Donald Trump returns as president. Is Britain ready?
We look forward to working with Donald Trump at this tough geopolitical moment, recognising that 77 million people voted for Donald Trump.
Also today, the British man accused of the Southport attack in which 3 young girls were killed has pleaded guilty to all charges on the first day of his trial. We will bring you the latest. Is working from home good for workers or the economy?
I wouldn't be able to be in the office 5 days a week because my social battery drains and I need to sometimes be just at home and just like to smash out loads of admin, for example.
People who work in service industries like retail have to go to work and others don't. Well, you know, what's different? They have children, they have problems, they have issues. You deal with it.
Joining us today, Labour MP Sarah Owen, Shadow Paymaster General Richard Holden, Parth Patel from the Institute of Public Policy Research and the former Conservative advisor Anita Boateng. This is Politics Live. Hello and welcome. It is Inauguration Day in Washington as Donald Trump is sworn in, or about to be, for a second time, and power is passed from Joe Biden to Donald Trump, who will become the 47th President of the United States. We can see images and the scene now in Washington. The inauguration ceremony and the taking of the oath of office will happen indoors at the US Capitol building because of the bitterly cold temperatures. But hundreds of thousands of supporters are expected to brave the freezing temperatures outside. Trump has promised a blitz of executive orders being signed almost immediately once he makes a transition there into the White House. He'll attend 3 inaugural balls across the city later on, celebrating his return to office. My opening question to the panel, starting with you, Sarah, is: are we ready for Trump too?
I certainly wasn't ready for that dancing in the opening shots, but I think he's laid out what he wants to do. I think the world is going to have an impact from a Trump administration, and importantly, who's pulling the strings behind him.
Are we ready for Trump too?
Well, I think the world has, you know, he's been voted in. We do have this period, don't we, in America, where you can sort of get a bit used to what's about to happen because we have that transfer period. I do also think that, you know, we saw some stuff in the last administration, particularly things like the Abraham Accords, where I think he did things, you know, around that international space which were actually very positive in a way that people perhaps hadn't expected. Whether Britain's ready is a slightly different question. We've still got, you know, there's obviously some historic messages from, let's say, people like David Lammy and others who'd been very critical of it. Obviously, that tone has changed now, and I think, you know, the government recognises that this is somebody we have to obviously do a lot of business with. I think there's still some slight issues with people like what Mayor Khan's been saying recently, and I think it'd be better for the entire country, especially when it's, you know, this is the start of a new presidency. If we were presenting a bit more of a united front going to see the new president.
Well, you're shaking your head.
Yes, I am. I think all good, honest relationships actually take criticism where it's due. And even J.D. Vance has criticised Donald Trump, and, you know, he's his right-hand man. So I think when we've got to hold truth to power, and accountability is incredibly important, even if they are one of the most powerful men in the world.
I agree with Sarah. That, you know, people should be honest. I think there's also something slightly different now. Is that obviously J.D. Vance said things before he was the vice president. Obviously David Lammy said things before he was the foreign secretary. I think now we've got the mayor of London, who is still in post, you know, saying about a resurgent fascism and things like that. I don't think is the right tone to be striking at this moment in time when we've got, you know, big international issues, whether it's Ukraine, the Middle East, whether it's our trading relationship.
Sure. And we're going to talk about those in just a moment. But just broadly, are we ready for Trump too?
No, I don't think the world is ready, because I don't think the world can be ready. Right? We're in the building of a new not just a new American political order, but a new world order. We know a new thing is emerging. We don't really know what that will be yet because, I mean, to some extent, Trump is unpredictable. That's baked in. But there are also real tensions in the Republican coalition. There are different visions for what the second Trump presidency might be, right? There's the populist nationalist vision of J.D. Vance. It's Main Street over Wall Street. It's Main America over coastal elites. It's America first. We're sort of used to that as a continuation of the Biden administration's project. But there is a second, much darker future possible for America. And I think we do have to entertain this fact of unchecked executive power and untrammeled corporate freedoms. This is the vision espoused by people like Elon Musk. And we do have to say Elon Musk. That's a much darker vision for America because in that world, Silicon Valley elites are working with very powerful politicians using state power towards their own ends. That's a remaking of the American Republic. And at that point, America is actually transitioning out of the liberal democratic regime we're used to into something else. That's a big question for Britain because for the first time since 1945, it might not stand for the same things America stands for. And so it has to ask fundamental questions of itself, which is what kind of country does it want to be? What does it stand for?
All right. Are we ready for Trump 2?
I agree with a lot of what you just said there. I think that we have to be prepared for all the possibilities, and it's very unclear at this point which of those kind of warring factions, I might kind of typify them and describe them slightly differently, but which of those forces win out. And I think the one thing that we will see as a continuation of Trump 1.0 is the kind of court of Donald Trump, where you have various people with sort of undefined roles, where their levels of influence are very unclear, and there's an increased jostling of power. You know, he went through 4 chiefs of staff. I mean, this is an extraordinary turnover. We may see, and we have seen, a more prepared Trump administration with more Trump advisors, but that doesn't yet mean that that kind of equilibrium will hold in the medium term. And just to talk about one thing in particular about Europe's readiness, I'm not just going to talk about the UK, it's that the question of tariffs is going to be something that really matters, not just because of what Trump has been saying, but because of the way that Trump has moved the dialogue in the US about tariffs. Because if you look at what Biden pursued, you could argue, you know, Trump started it, Biden continued it and doubled down. And now we're in a situation where it's clear that the Europeans, for instance, are offering concessions in order to get Trump back to the table of a more reasonable conversation, when a couple of years ago they were doing the opposite.
Well, let's get a sense of the build-up in Washington. It is chilly out there, as we can talk to BBC correspondent Caroline Hawley, who's outside Capital One Arena, and you can see people queuing up there to what looks like a pre-inauguration rally. Caroline, what can we expect to see over the next 24 hours as Donald Trump is sworn in?
Well, what the people here are queuing up for is to see the inauguration on giant screens inside that arena where Donald Trump held what was called a victory rally yesterday. The inauguration has, of course, been moved inside. That will take place in the Capitol Rotunda, but people here are queuing up to see that on giant screens. And then there will be a parade at the arena, and then we're expecting Donald Trump to sign a blizzard of executive orders. He's promised to roll back environmental protections. He's promised the biggest deportation in US history, in a crackdown against undocumented migrants. There are a whole lot of things he said he's going to do, but should we talk to the people who are here and why they're here? Because there's some very strong feelings. You've come here despite the temperatures. Where have you come from?
So I came here, I go to school in Boston, but originally I'm from Honolulu in Hawaii.
And you voted for Donald Trump?
Yes, I did this election.
What do you want to see him do? What's the most important thing for you?
So for young voters like me and my best friend, we were very excited to see him bring back TikTok last night.
Oh, yeah?
It went out in the States, and it's one of the biggest social media apps among our generation. So when that went out, that was a big issue. And when it came back, everyone across the country felt some sort of relief in our generation. Looking forward, I know he's talked a lot about imposing much tariffs on a lot of imported goods. I know that there's pros and cons to that. I study economics. I'm a second-year university student. However, I am actually quite interested to see how that affects our economy and domestic production.
And why was it important for you to be here today?
Well, for one, I only see my family once every year since I moved to the continental U.S. So since they're here, it was very exciting for me to see them again. But at the same time, this is the first national politics event that I've ever attended, and this is such a historical moment.
Do you have any concerns about what he might do? Because I know lots of young women are worried about equality, diversion, inclusion, that he's almost sort of declared a culture war on. That doesn't worry you?
Not so much. Maybe I'm not too worried about that right now in my personal experience. But I think him giving the decisions back to the states still gives the voters the voice to make the laws.
Thanks so much for talking to us. Can I bring you in? You and your dog Max,
this is
right?
Max, yeah.
And Max has come here despite the cold.
Oh yeah, well,
about him?
yeah. We live in San Francisco. We voted for Trump this past time because we think it's important that we bring the law more towards the center. Biden.
What do you mean by that?
Biden, I don't think he enforced the laws. Like, the border was open. We had more illegal immigrants coming to the country than any time in our history. And so it's important that you have immigrants come into the country, but you have to do it in a legal and organized way. So as long as it's legal, organized, and you can screen who's coming in, it's important. But just to have it open and then anyone come in, it's a chance, it's a risk. I don't think it's worth taking.
That's the most important issue for you.
Yeah, that one and the economy. I think Trump would be better for the economy because he understands it better than Biden did. So I'm hopeful. I am hopeful that we'll see better results the next 4 years.
And when will you know when America has been made great again, as the slogan goes?
I would say midterms. So by 2026, 2027, we'll know. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
I hope you get in. So waiting in a few hours' time, Donald Trump will be president again here. It's left his supporters jubilant and opponents demoralised and in some cases afraid.
Well, Caroline Hawley...
A new era is beginning.
Well, absolutely. Caroline Hawley, thank you very much for standing out there with Trump supporters in the cold to report from Washington. Well, that is a flavour of what some of Donald Trump's supporters are hoping for. Great sense of anticipation there in the hours leading up to the inauguration ceremony. Coming back here to politics in the UK, the Foreign Secretary, David Lammy, was heaping praise on Donald Trump this morning. Let's have a listen.
Donald Trump I met was a man, had incredible grace, generosity, very keen to be a good host, very funny, very friendly, very warm, I have to say, about the UK, our royal family.
Now, he has in the past said that Donald Trump was deluded, dishonest and xenophobic. But now he is in government. He is the Foreign Secretary and Donald Trump is soon to be back in the White House. Do you share those sentiments with the Foreign Secretary, Sarah?
I've never met Donald Trump, so maybe he's different in person. But from what I have seen, there have been problems around the way he speaks about women. There's been problems about the way he speaks about ethnic minorities and disabled people. So I would take issue with some of those. And I don't necessarily think that's a charming, graceful way for leadership. But what I do see is when it comes to policies, particularly the environmental policies, there's a lot that we could say about the equality policies and the culture wars he stoked. But the environmental ones, can we not see the irony? He's got supporters stood outside in -16 temperatures while the other side of America is on fire, literally on fire, and he wants to tear up environmental policies. Surely that cannot be good, not just for America, but for the rest of the world as well.
Richard?
Look, I think when we're looking at what Donald Trump's doing and what he's done, I think David Lammy is taking, eventually is now taking the right approach. We've got to deal with our most important defence and intelligence ally, one of the most important economic allies that we have. It's a shame that they've had to be dragged kicking and screaming to this position, but, you know, they are there now. And I just say as well, we've got to have a really practical relationship with the US, because it's not just about that sort of trade or about what we want to project into America. It's also about what they do for us as well. And there are huge implications when there's a big change in administration for our policies around the world as well.
Well, do you back and support what you've heard from David Lammy, that he is finally, in your words, Richard, taking a much more conciliatory, or more than that, a praiseworthy tone towards Donald Trump? I'm just going to remind viewers what you said very recently in the House of Commons about the president.
We're about to witness the inauguration of a man as president who openly boasted, and I quote, about grabbing women by the p***. A man who has lost another lawsuit against a woman who claimed he raped her and has 26 claims of sexual assault against him.
Are you going to change or revise anything that you think or feel about Donald Trump?
If any of that's untrue, I would, but it's not untrue. So, no, I won't.
And you're glad to be outside of government so you can speak your mind?
No, because I think, as I said to Richard earlier, I think a relationship is holding up a mirror to the truth and holding up accountability. He is the leader. He has been democratically elected, but that doesn't mean that we have to agree with absolutely everything that he says. But what Richard said there was true about the fact that we do have a relationship with America that goes beyond trade, and it goes beyond who's in charge of the White House too. We have family links, we have friendship, we have history, a joint and shared one, which actually is a lot deeper than just who's in charge of the White House.
I think that's a point that Sarah and I agree on. Look, and well, you were the panellists said earlier on, well, what about since 1945? Well, actually, let's look at what happened in, whether it's in Suez in the 50s or in Vietnam in the 60s and 70s. There have been major points of difference between the US and the UK over the years. However, I think the point Sarah's making is that, those deeper ties, even when it goes, there are difficult current policy issues, continue. And that's why I think we've got to be so sensitive to a degree about some of the language we're now using, especially when there's so much on the table right at the start of a new presidency. Right,
so is this wise? Part of the Observer, Sadiq Khan, the Mayor of London, warns Western democracy at risk from resurgent fascism ahead of Trump inauguration. London Mayor calls for stricter laws on harmful online content and takes aim at Elon Musk. When the UK is waiting to see what Donald Trump is going to do, and there could be tariffs that really do harm trading, to take one example, is that the right way to proceed?
I mean, that's a pretty inflammatory way to describe it. I mean, the word fascism, I think, just does more to confuse and clarify. And to some extent, it is Trump's world and we're all living in it. And so there is some real pragmatism that's required here. But Britain, I think, is desperately now in search of a new common sense. And I think a helpful way to think about this is the difference between the states and the parties that run the states, right? The British state and the American state have to have and will always have a very important relationship, an international relationship of security and coordination. That is true and that will continue to be true. But the Labour Party and the Republican Party in its current incarnation are almost diametrically opposed on some of the most fundamental concepts. And it's different to what Richard was saying. It's not Suez, because these are concepts of rule of law, of women's rights, of the importance of the administrative state. These are so fundamental, these differences. They can't be bridged. These are ideological things that cannot be bridged, and that will cause tensions over the years to come between the British government and the American government, and that will play out.
Tensions that the government is wanting and willing to overcome because the stakes are extremely high.
Yes. But ultimately, Trump, even though Trump does like the UK, which, David Lammy referenced there, that doesn't mean he's going to be good for the UK necessarily. And I think despite the best efforts of the Foreign Secretary and others, it's not clear that the Trump advisors and Trump himself are particularly well disposed to this administration. Let's not, go 3 minutes without discussing Elon Musk and his position, a very specific position on Keir Starmer and his suitability, but also the reality of some of the challenges of the kind of comments of the past, which I'm sure some leaders would transcend and others may perhaps hold a grudge. And I might slightly...
Well, what do you think is going to happen in this case?
Towards that persuasion. So I think that there will be some of these difficulties. I've also, the question of Dame Karen Pierce, who has been doing a wonderful job as ambassador. Obviously, Peter Mandelson, a really serious political figure, but how that will land also because she was pretty popular. There are a lot of things to navigate here where personality will matter in a slightly unpredictable administration.
What I do worry about a little little bit is Sadiq Khan's comments, for example. There's playing internal politics within the Labour Party about some of that, and I don't think at this moment in time there should be internal politics being played out on a national stage. You know, that great Kinnock speech from 1985, you know, the year I was born, you don't play politics with people's jobs and people's services, and I think there's a danger of that from elements of the Labour Party who are trying to signal perhaps the future within their own party rather than thinking about the good of the country.
But is it OK to play politics with people's lives, Richard? Because that's essentially what I think Sadiq Khan, maybe I wouldn't have chosen those words, but Sadiq Khan is trying to protect the people and make people feel safe in London. Yes, he is.
No, he's not.
Yes, he is, because his
he's
whole
on a
message...
virtue signal to his own
Let me finish.
community.
Thanks. He's said that London is welcome and open for all, and that has been his entire message, which is completely opposite to what Donald Trump has said about bits of America. So, of course, he's won a record number of mayoral elections. He's hugely popular in London. It's one of the most diverse cities in the entire world. He has an absolute right to say what he feels that reflects his constituency.
I think that's true.
We just disagree.
To be a politician is to take part in the battle of ideas, Richard, and you do have to do that as well as the pragmatic.
I don't think this is. From what I see from him doing, I don't think this is about a battle of ideas. I think this is about him trying to score points within the Labour Party for the future.
Well, let's talk about the grudge potential grudge that you mentioned, because, of course, Peter Mandelson, Lord Mandelson, is Starmer's nomination for ambassador to the US. And I think we can hear a little of what Peter Mandelson said about Donald Trump in 2019. Let's have a listen.
An American president who is little short of a white nationalist and racist. What Donald Trump represents and believes is anathema to mainstream British opinion. And the idea that we have to kowtow to an American president who holds those views will outrage people in Britain.
And as I say, he is the nomination, our man, in Washington. Do you think there is a chance that his nomination could be rejected?
I think that would be extraordinary and pretty unprecedented. So I don't think we should go that far. And incidentally, having kind of political appointments for these kinds of roles is not anathema, especially to US politics. So I don't think it's that particular component of it. Actually, I think Mandelson's position on China may prove to be slightly more challenging, although, I mean, everyone here can take a punt at what they think Trump's position will ultimately end up being on China. But because of that unpredictability, it's really hard to tell how that will play. And also, you know, EU-US relations continue to be, I would argue, more strained than they have been in modern times, and certainly than they were in his last presidency. And you also have the dual challenge of very weakened or moribund European leaders.
Are you looking forward to, well, Peter Mandelson, if he is accepted, being the nominee?
I think that they'll probably be both have met each other's match. I think you've got two princes of darkness there, which will probably go down very well. They'll probably love that, to be honest. I think they'll both like the challenge. In terms of diplomacy, in terms of being able to argue for each other's...
That's an interesting take on it, yes, referencing the Prince of Darkness, the term that was used for Peter Mandelson at the point he was in, certainly, Tony Blair's government.
I think I met Karen Pierce over in Washington.
She's the former outgoing
ambassador. The outgoing ambassador, when I was a cabinet minister. And she's clearly not just across it, but she understands, it incredibly well.
How do you think Peter Mandelson?
Well, look, I do sort of. I just have these sort of flashes of the 70s when there was our last big individual appointment. This, in that case, again by a Labour government to the US of the then Prime Minister's, I think, son-in-law. And this is another hand-picked appointment from a Labour Prime Minister to a political appointment to a diplomatic role. And I think that carries. I think what that does is it perhaps on one side from Keir Starmer it shows that this is something he's taking seriously. On the flip side, though, it is a big gamble for him personally, making a political appointment of somebody to that role.
What did you? How did you react when you heard it was Peter Mandelson?
I was slightly shocked. I mean, I thought Peter Mandelson at the time had been trying to become Chancellor of the University of Oxford, but
along with others, I think
indeed,
at the time. Do you think this will suit him better?
I mean, far be it from me.
Far be it from you.
I think it reflects how the of diplomacy is changing. You know, Trump has a completely different sort of unknown approach to diplomacy, and it's very transactional. And maybe a political appointment in the role of a diplomat is maybe the right actual response.
Well, let me just throw this in BBC News headline. Perhaps unsurprisingly, US-UK relations will flourish under Trump, says the Prime Minister, Keir Starmer. But no government minister is going to the inauguration. It's not unusual. World leaders aren't routinely invited for inauguration. But here are some people who are there and attending. You can see there the former Home Secretary there, Suella Braverman, and Reform UK leader Nigel Farage. And then I think we can also see a picture of the former Conservative Prime Minister Liz Truss. And I think Boris Johnson may be there too, and the current Shadow Foreign Secretary, Priti Patel, there in that pose outside the Capitol building. Yes, what do you make? Oh, by the way, these pictures all come from their Twitter accounts. What do you make of this group of Conservatives out for the inauguration?
Well, I think it's important that the UK is represented. It's great to see Priti there. It's great to see Suella there. Last time I saw her and her husband was the Spectator Awards dinner. It was always quite a fun evening. Yeah, we're obviously going to be there. I don't know who's representing the UK. Has David Lammy gone or?
No,
as I said.
Let me just pick you up on that, Richard, because they're not there representing the UK. They're there representing the Conservative Party, which is the sister party of the Republicans, and that's completely normal. And if it was a Democrat going into the White House, you'd have sister party members going over as well.
The UK political party.
But in terms of who's representing the UK in an official capacity, that's your friend Dame Karen, and I've met her, and she's absolutely, as you're right, she is well respected, and she will do a fantastic job representing the UK there at the inauguration.
Right, we referred to the breaking news at the beginning of the programme in the headlines. The Southport attacker, Axel Rudakabana, has pleaded guilty to murdering 3 girls at a dance class. He's also admitted 10 counts of attempted murder, producing ricin and possessing an al-Qaeda training manual on what was due to be the first day of his trial. That will now not go ahead, and he will be sentenced later on in the week. Let's talk to our Home Affairs correspondent, Daniel Sanford. What's happened?
Yeah, very dramatic scenes at Liverpool Crown Court this morning. I was watching on a video link, and what was expected to be a day of swearing in a jury and various other administrative tasks. When Axel Rudakabana was brought into the dock, he refused to confirm his name. His barrister had to confirm that it was indeed him in the dock in the formal way, and then his barrister said that he would like the charges to be put to him again. And then as the 16 charges were all read out, a formal guilty plea was entered instead of the not guilty pleas that had been formally entered. And he essentially pleaded guilty to all 16 charges. Those are the murders of B.B. King, Elsie Stancombe and Alice da Silva Aguiar, the attempted murders of 8 other children, and the attempted murders of Leanne Lucas, the woman who was running the dance class where the girls were attacked, and also Jonathan Hayes, a man who came to help. He's also pleaded guilty to possessing a bladed weapon, in this case a large knife. He's pleaded guilty to possessing a document that might be useful for terrorists. That's an American military study of an al-Qaeda manual, and also pleaded guilty to the production of ricin. Under his bed at his house was found a tub with some ricin-like substances in it, which had been produced by him. He is now essentially confirmed by pleading guilty. This obviously was a surprise and brings to an end the question about who was responsible for the girl's death and whether there was some kind of mental health debate, mental health defence. But it is going to open up a huge discussion about why he wasn't stopped, because Axel Rudakabana is a man about whom a young man about whom a great deal was known by the local authorities. He was expelled from school. He went back and attacked a pupil at the school after he was expelled. He was in 2 other educational establishments after that. Sometimes police used to visit the house to accompany teachers because they were so worried about his violence. He was on the books of mental health services, he was on the books of children's services, and I believe he was also referred to Prevent at one point. Though one of the problems we've had in this case is that no public authority has wanted to engage in discussing him for fear of somebody mistakenly publishing something that would prejudice the jury, though obviously many experienced journalists are quite capable of knowing things and not publishing them.
Daniel, can you remind us and the viewers about those two later charges that he has also pleaded guilty to? Because they came several months after the tragic killings of the three girls.
Yeah, and the significance of this is obviously the misinformation around the time of the murders, which suggested that a man with a Muslim name had carried out the murders and that they had been a failed asylum seeker, the person that had carried out the murders. Well, obviously, Axel Rudakabana was born in Wales, so he wasn't a failed asylum seeker, and there's no indication of him having any Islamist inclinations. But he has been charged with possessing a US military study of an Al-Qaeda manual, and obviously there was a great deal of concern about what kind of reaction that would produce given the rioting in the summer. So when the two charges were added, it was done with great care and sensitivity and quite a lot of briefing that this was a charge of possessing a study of a terrorist manual produced by Al-Qaeda. It was not suggestion of ideological material. For what I can gather, Axel Rudakabana was a very, very disturbed young man with a real obsession with violence, really serious obsession with people like Adolf Hitler, Genghis Khan, the IRA, obviously the Rwandan genocide, because he himself was of Rwandan heritage. He was obsessed with all forms of violence, but there doesn't seem to have been any single ideology that he'd hooked onto, and certainly Islamism is just one of a number of ideologies that he seems to have researched. There's also some question about whether he had some kind of anti-woman or anti-girl ideology. But because public bodies have been very loath to brief on this, we don't really know the full extent of that. But certainly, although he has been charged with and pleaded guilty now to possessing an American study of the Al-Qaeda manual, which would be useful for terrorists, there still is not a suggestion that he was a committed Islamist extremist in any way.
Daniel Sanford, thank you very much for bringing us up to date and all that detail. Maybe I could just get some reaction to the news that Axel Rudakabana has pleaded guilty to all the charges that were placed before him, and that means the trial won't go ahead.
I hope that this will spare the families more suffering than having to go through a trial than they have already endured. My heart goes out to Alice, Bibi's and Elise's family, because to go through this is just absolutely horrific. And I think what Daniel pointed out there was that, is there a point where this could have been prevented? Is there a point where there was a failing in the system? And I think that that is now a really key question that has to come out of this. Of course, after justice has been done, because I think that that should be the #1 priority here.
Richard?
I totally agree with the points that Sarah's made there. I think also there was a there was a lot of talk about this at the time, and it was also that Parliament would be informed as soon as possible, so that obviously issues around this, because there were issues raised around this case at the time, could be talked about in the open. I'm sure that the government will be doing that now as well, and I think that'll be another good moment where actually perhaps some of the issues that Sarah's talked about around what could have been done in different ways can also be got out there, because also from Daniel's report there, it's very unclear as to exactly the motivations and things like that. I'm sure some of that will come out later, as you know, there's legal argument to the trial. I think it was, you know, this all did happen very quickly, because from my understanding, the victims' parents, who'd hoped to be able to be in court, weren't actually even there at the time, because of this all happened incredibly quickly and unexpectedly.
Right, well, as you say, there was a lot of debate, which Daniel Sanford talked about and alluded to, cases of transparency about what the authorities and what the police knew at the time, and those two later charges relating to Ricin and the possession of that manual. Robert Jenrick, the Shadow Justice Secretary, before we knew that Axel Rudakabana was going to plead guilty, did tweet this earlier today. My statement on the Southport trial. Today, the alleged attacker Axel Rudakabana is in court. The first priority is to ensure this process delivers justice for the victims and their families after the horrific attack on innocent children. People should be mindful of what they say, as it could jeopardise a criminal trial. He goes on to say, but once this trial is over, Keir Starmer must be held to account. What did he know know and when? Why did it take months for the police to reveal they were investigating the suspect's possessions of documents relating to Al-Qaeda and a biological weapon? The public have a right to know and get honest answers. Any suggestion of a cover-up will permanently damage public trust in our authorities and whether we're being told the truth about crime in our country. What's he getting at, Richard?
Well, I think he's being very clear. There's a lot of debate at the time, and actually now, when we can get that hopeful statement from the government in the next couple of days in the House, and there can be a question about it. And I think it's very clear. He was at the very start of his statement there, being very clear that nothing should be done to jeopardise the trial, but there's also big questions to be answered around it as well.
Are there big questions to answer for the Prime Minister?
I think Robert Jenrick should have stopped at his first tweet, quite frankly, if he was being responsible in his position of power. If he wanted to talk about possible motivations, as we'd heard from your reporter there was also about almost possible incel behaviour against women and girls, and that this dates back years throughout this man's life. And if we want to look at responsibility, I think actually we should be looking about accountability and change and how we ensure that this doesn't happen again.
Right. Do you think there was a cover-up? That there are questions around a cover-up?
Well, look, we don't know. There's clearly this.
But he's raised this,
and I think that's irresponsible.
The questions around this person's clearly, and obviously he's still in, he's not been sentenced yet. There's clearly huge questions around this person's involvement with social services, around all sorts of other. We don't know what parts of the state he's been involved with. So let's just wait before we jump to a conclusion.
Well, he's just jumped to a conclusion, Richard. He has.
He's asked a perfectly fair questions.
I think it's fair to say there's a conspiratorial tone in Jenrick's tweet.
Yes.
And I think he is importing the paranoid style of politics from Trump into that tweet, and I think that is dangerous. I think we should be careful about making accusations of a cover-up for a case we don't know anything about. I think the right question to be asking is, could state intelligence services have intervened earlier? Because not only did this cause a mass stabbing in Southport, it led to the most widespread racist rioting in this country in a century. So that is a really significant question, and that is where we should be focusing on what could the state have done if it knew so much about this individual to have prevented it getting to this stage.
What do you make of the intervention? Admittedly, there is an intervention, but still, I presume he stands by the tweet and what he said.
Presumably, I think it's unhelpful, actually, because fundamentally, I think there are really important questions to be answered, and transparency is one of the only ways that you really engender trust in the state. But at the moment, it's clear, I mean, Daniel Sanford seemed to imply it, that journalists probably know quite a lot about this individual, but have not revealed it. And so I think he may have jumped the gun there in going in this direction until now that we know that there's not going to be a big trial. I think the information will be, I'm hoping, I want to be optimistic about the state of our society and our institutions such that we can get this kind of information quite quickly to understand it. I'm very interested in some of this dimension around gender, which I think is something that we've seen through some of these lone wolf, whatever we're going to call them or not, attacks, be they terrorist motivated as well. There's often this kind of interlinking of violence against women and girls. So I think there's a lot to understand, and I think that will help police hopefully get upstream of identifying the people that are really fundamentally very dangerous. Robert Jenrick should ask questions. He absolutely should. It's just whether that question around cover-up is a helpful thing to insert at this point in time.
Right. I mean, Sarah, what about issues around violence against women and girls, and what authorities knew, perhaps, about the background and what we can learn?
I think this highlights, and I completely agree with the points that you've just made, hatred doesn't stay in one lane, but quite often we find that misogyny and hate for women and girls and violence against women and girls goes hand in hand with racism, with anti-LGBT views. It doesn't stay in one lane. So I think if they had actual information about that dates back further and further as to why it was this murderer has now slipped through the net, we need to know why it couldn't be intervened sooner, because the consequences have been absolutely horrific.
Well, dramatic news, as we have just been discussing. And Axel Rudakabana will be sentenced on Thursday. We're going to talk about something completely different, and it's about working from home. A BBC Panorama programme is going out tonight called Should We Still Be Working From Home? Let's take a look at a clip from the programme.
Being able to be in the office around kind of like all my colleagues and stuff, it's just obviously more inspiring and get a lot more done.
Let's say you get a new boss and they decide that you have to come in 5 days a week. What would you say to them?
I wouldn't be able to be in the office 5 days a week because my social battery drains and I need to sometimes be just at home and just like to smash out loads of admin, for example.
People who drive trains have to go to work. People who work in operating theatres have to go to work. People who work in service industries like retail have to go to work, and others don't. Well, you know, what's different? They have children, they have problems, they have issues. You deal with it.
Is working from home something that we should continue pursuing in the employment rights bill? It could be even easier to request hybrid working. Is that right? Should it go further?
I just want to ask, I wonder how many times Lord Rose has had to just deal with it when his kids have got snotty noses or when he's had to take in the shopping or anything like that.
I'd say it's the former boss of Marks and Spencer's.
Former boss of Marks and Spencer's there. So I would say that, you know, some of the jobs that he mentioned there are actually working shifts. And there's a reason why you have, like, train drivers, you have firefighters, you have nurses working shifts, and that is because you get longer periods of time off in between. This work-life balance is so important to actually getting it right for the employer as well as the employee, because as you heard from that young lady, sometimes you just want to be able to be on your own, switch off and be able to smash through that work. And if you've got a chatty matey next to you, not just pointing at you, Richard,
I was going to say,
distracting you, you can actually be a lot more productive in your own space and not travelling.
Right, do you agree with that, Richard? Or do you agree with Lord Rose, who actually says we've regressed in this country in terms of working practices, productivity and in terms of the country's well-being by, I think, 20 years?
Look, I think Stuart Rose was making a point that there's a lot of people don't get a choice, right? If you're, I spent my formative years working in hospitality. My job was to be there on the front line serving people in a restaurant. There's a lot of people doing that sort of service job or physical jobs where their physical presence is required in the country, and they don't get a choice. I think he was just reflecting on that. I think on the flip side, I actually think the lady made a really important point in that. In her first comments, which was actually you learn a huge amount. I certainly did when I first went into the office by a bit of osmosis with the people around me. I'm sure that your staff do that as well, Sarah. I think that's really important to have that presence in the environment, because you do pick up stuff which you just don't get if you're
the sort of water cooler
isolated.
moments or the
Not just that, but it's just the people you meet and things like that. And I think that's an important thing to be part of. And I do think there's a bit of a sort of sometimes we can be a bit nannying of people to say, oh, well, actually, you don't need to be part of that. Well, I think those things are important for you to be part of, especially at the start of your career. And sometimes it's, if you're a high-end middle manager in a big, accountancy firm or something, you've got a nice garden somewhere, in the leafy Surrey, you can be very happy to work from home, right? But if you're, just starting out, I remember I shared a house share with 8 people when I was first in London. The idea we'd all work from home, right? We'd go under each other's feet, and we'd have never got those connections to help us to move up and on as well.
I would also say, though, that in terms of nannying, there's also the flip side of being too prescriptive to businesses and to employers as well as employees. I think there is a balance to be struck here, and I think that we can be sensible about that.
Have we regressed in terms of working practices? Is it healthy for the pendulum to have tilted more towards working from home, if you can, than being in the office?
I'm actually quite worried about this because I think we have an epidemic of loneliness, of people struggling to find connection, particularly kind of starting careers, feeling connected and giving purpose. And I do think that our ability to interact literally in person, face to face and have conversations, there are studies that have shown that we are actually getting worse at that. And so I do think that businesses have to pick a model that makes sense for them. Some will lean towards a lot of working from home, others won't. But I think as a broad society, pushing people to do more interaction in person, to learn and understand how to communicate, is a good thing in aggregate.
I think we could all do with being a little bit more humble on this debate. This is a pretty significant structural change in the economy, right? Working from home has become standard for all employees with a university degree. That's a massive, unexpected and significant shift in the economy. The debate is basically characterised by opinions and hearsay. Some boss or some firm says it's bad for productivity. Some worker says this is great. Like, we don't actually understand what this means, and there are studies coming out that this could be good for the economy. But I think. And
what about the social question?
The social question is a fascinating question. I don't know. I would like that hypothesis to be tested. I think working from home is an experiment for workplaces in the economy. It's also an experiment for families in the home, right? The home is where we normally hang out with our loved ones. We watch a bit of telly. We make dinner. It's now also the workplace. That is a fundamental reimagination of what the point of a home is. It will have impacts on family structure and the way we design homes. We don't know the answer to these things. things, we should think about it more deliberately rather than sort of asking someone's opinion for some conjecture on is this good or bad for the economy.
All right. Well, on that note, I'm afraid we've run out of time. But that edition of Panorama, should we still be working from home, I can tell they're all going to be watching it, is on BBC One from home at 8 o'clock tonight and is already on the iPlayer. But that's it for today. I'll be back tomorrow with more Politics Live, more chatty guests at 12:15. Bye-bye.